to introduce Tom Verde, who is an accomplished writer and journalist with a deep focus on religion, history, and culture. He holds a master's degree in Islamic studies and Christian Muslim relations from Hartford Seminary, reflecting his strong academic foundation in interfaith understanding. Drawing on extensive travel and lived experience in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, his work offers rich, informed perspectives on global cultures and traditions. His writing has appeared in prominent outlets, including the New York Times, National Public Radio, Religion News Services, and AramcoWorld magazine. Next Friday, he'll also be running a book discussion here on, remind me the title, sorry.
Separation of Church and Hate.
The Separation of Church and Hate. And the book, I believe, is available here at the library, so please feel free to join him next Friday as well during the day at 11 o'clock. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to leave you with Tom. Comfortable?
Yeah, it's fine. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I mean, this is a great turnout. I mean, I can only presume you're here, as a condition of your probation or something, or there was some message in the announcement about an open bar. I don't know, but it's great to see you. So before I get going, I do want to thank this library for being here, for being so supportive to the community, to writers like myself. And I'm going to tell you that this book would never have come about if it hadn't been for the support of the library staff, but in particular, the interlibrary loan librarians here. Molly Linder, who's in the back hiding out, she's there, but she really is a fantastic woman and resource. And her predecessor, Ivy Burns, I started out with her and she moved on up to a library in Maine. But without the two of them, it would have taken me forever to write this book. I might not have even gotten it done because of all the legwork that had to be done, all the research, all the tracking down of the various, books, original sources, secondary sources. It really, I would send an email to Molly, and she could get you a book on Mars. I don't mean a book about Mars. I mean a book that is on Mars. She could track it down for you. So anyway, thank you very much, very much. So, all right. Yes. Yeah. It's a terrific library, as I'm sure you know. Well, I am gonna take questions after my talk. So please save your questions if you could. But I'm sure one question that you all have on your mind is, how is it that an old white guy from Connecticut came to write a book about historic Muslim women rulers? And I'm going to tell you that it began with this woman right here, whose name was Shajarat al-Dur, and she was Egypt's only queen to sit on the throne since Cleopatra. And I learned about her in a book that I was reviewing on the history of Cairo. And there was a brief mention of this woman who ruled during the Middle Ages. And I thought to myself, really? It was a woman ruling in an Islamic empire during the Middle Ages? That doesn't sound right to me. And but I began to investigate her life more and found out more about her. And she was a fascinating, remarkable, accomplished woman. Like I said, she lived during the 13th century. She was born a slave, and she became the wife of Sultan al-Salah, who fought during the time of the Seventh Crusade, which was launched in 1248 by Louis the Ninth of France. So after her husband died, during the conflict, she realized that the news of his death might demoralize the troops, and so she kept it secret. She kept her husband's death a secret. And Louis was captured, and she negotiated his release and an end to the conflict, thereby saving Egypt from conquest from a foreign power. So all the while, she kind of ran things from behind the scenes while her husband was dead in a room. And then she finally had it arranged for him to go be buried. And when the news finally came out that he was dead, the soldiers, her nobles, said, you've done such a great job. We're going to elevate you to the throne. And so she did rule. She ruled for a while, a year or so or more. and but eventually she came to kind of an unhappy end. There's a bit of a scandalous story there, and there's a lot of scandalous stories in this book, which is one of the reasons you should buy it. It's really juicy. It really is. I promise you. It's like Game of Thrones meets The Godfather. It's like The Godfather for women. That's what this book is like. So it's a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to write, and I think it's a lot of fun to read. But anyway, after her husband died, she married for political reasons to this minor military commander, a fellow by the name of Ibeck, and he was kind of a, I don't know, he was kind of a jerk, a bit of a dunce. He was he was kind of an underqualified, overconfident military commander, sort of like the Pete Hegseth of the medieval Muslim world. And but he started looking around for another wife. You know, in Islam, you could have up to 4 wives. So he started to look around for another wife, and she wasn't too keen on that. She said, "No, it's me or nobody. That's it." And so she ended up having him killed, which really sealed her fate. And she did it in a very well. There's a couple of versions of how she had him killed. One was that she had some of the eunuchs in the bath stab him to death right when he came into the bath. And but a juicier version was that she invited him into the bath with her so she could bathe him personally. And while she was doing so, she was, rubbing him with soaps and things. And this guy had been married before, and he divorced his first wife to marry her. Um, and she asked him, she said, "Why are you looking around for another wife? Don't I please you?" And this moron, having learned nothing from having 2 wives, his response was, "Well, you're old. I want a younger woman." And so she took a dagger out from the towels next to the bath and just stabbed him to death in the bath. And the blood and the water, like splashing out of the tub, went out, seeped under the door, and somebody saw it, and they came in and burst in, and they found her there. And it was a big scandal, and she ended up being imprisoned, and ultimately tossed over a tower where the dogs devoured her. Like I said, this book is just full of this stuff. I'm telling you, you can't make it up. It's just so great. So anyway, but this is her tomb in Cairo. It's a beautiful tomb, and the what you see there on the top is a beautiful mosaic of her name meant tree of pearls. She was very fond of pearls, and so they put a tree of pearls decoration in her tomb there. So she got me interested in learning. I said, if this fantastic woman existed, were there more? There must be more, right? I mean, I didn't think she was just an exception, and indeed she was not. There were a lot of women that ruled Islamic empires, and so I found several stories, and I pitched the stories as a series to a magazine called the AramcoWorld magazine that I was writing for at the time, and they agreed to publish six stories in this series. So when I was writing this series, I remember telling people, they say, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on this series about Islamic women rulers." And inevitably, the person would say, "Really? There were Islamic women rulers?" And I thought this would be kind of an answer or a corrective to that question. So I learned a lot about a lot of these different women. I'm going to talk about some of them here in the talk. So the book, as I say, it's about a lot of different women from a lot of different parts of the Muslim world over the course of about 1,000 years, from the early centuries, the founding of Islam, up until the close of the 17th century. And I chose those years for a reason, which I'll get to later. But first, let's look at a few more of these remarkable women. So some were born into wealth and privilege, like Razia Sultan on the left here. She was the ruler of India's Sultanate of Delhi during the 13th century, or Pari Khan Khanum on the right there, who oversaw Persia's Safavid Empire. The modern, and today's Iran is the descendant of the Safavid Empire. It was established back in the Middle Ages, or not in the early modern era. So these women were entrusted with the governing of the kingdom by their fathers, who feared that their sons were either too reckless or too self-indulgent or just simply too fat-headed to rule. And they recognized that their daughters were smart and clever and could govern and had the stuff to do it. So they appointed them their successors. Now others ascended to the throne via the power structure of the harem, and harems were essentially the women's quarters of the royal palace or the residence. The word harem comes from the Arabic word haram, which means forbidden. And Islam is not the only culture that in history that's had harems. Women have had their own quarters in ancient China. In ancient Greece, women had their own. They were segregated. In Rome, women hung out together. So it's not like Islam did this purposefully and specifically or solely, I should say, um, to women. But the harem in the Islamic world was a very uh, highly organized structure. You probably can't read this here, but there was a series of what could I say, bureaucracies that existed within the harem, and so this is just the Ottoman example. Unfortunately, a lot of what we learned about the harem, or listen to what Western civilization learned about the harem, came from these guys on the right. These are foreign ambassadors to the Sultan's court. And these are some of history's greatest gossipers and sources of fake news. Denied access to the harem, they imagined that it was something like this, right? Sorry, ladies, but this is the male mind at work here. You know, we can split the atom, right? But tell us there's women on the other side of a wall, and this is what we come up with. So in truth, the harem was really like a court. It was a formal setting where women of the household looked to domestic affairs, like India's Nur Jahan on the right, who's featured in my book. Also, a lot of what went on there in the harem was very ordinary household stuff. It was raising, making meals, just taking care of the household. Most importantly, women rose to power from the harem. Some ran businesses, some became extremely wealthy. Al Khaizaran was a slave who became the wife of the Abbasid Caliph Al Mahdi, and she was the first de facto women ruler of a Muslim empire. She had her own palace from which she ran a textile and embroidery business. She also acquired numerous properties in and around Baghdad, as well as vast estates on the outskirts of the city, as far away as Egypt and Mesopotamia. So her immense wealth made her the richest person in the Muslim world at the time, second only to the Caliph himself. So by the time of her death, her annual income was equivalent to roughly half the state revenue. So this is a very, very powerful, wealthy, influential woman. Many queens also directed diplomatic affairs. They negotiated treaties. They oversaw domestic security, issued military commands. The Indian Empress Nur Jahan not only did all that, but like Khaizaran, she grew fabulously wealthy by owning her own fleet of ships, merchant ships, in addition to creating her own signature perfume, as well as a line of clothing, dabbling in garden design. And on top of it all, she was also a tiger hunting sharpshooter. So, in short, these multi talented, remarkable women were extensions not only of the royal household, but of the government itself. One of my favorites in the book was this woman, Roxelana. She was probably the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, and she more or less co ruled with her husband, the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, during the mid 16th century. Excuse me. She came from Roatan, which is a town in western Ruthenia, in what is now the Ukraine, but which at the time was part of Poland. And she's still revered there as a local heroine or celebrity, and/or celebrity. The town in the region is near the border, where a lot of refugees have fled during the current Ukrainian war, and she was a refugee of sorts herself, actually. She was likely captured in 1516 during a raid by Crimean slave traders who routinely scoured the Ukrainian countryside, rounding up unfortunate victims to sell in the Ottoman slave markets. So I'm going to tell a little bit of that experience here. I'll just read you a little excerpt from the book. Um, so one contemporary observer, amazed at the great numbers of these slaves to be seen at the slave markets, asked whether there were any people left in the land where these slaves were brought from. So many people from Slavic lands, extending from Russia to Eastern Europe, were taken into slavery, in fact, that the word slave derives from association with their ethnicity. So that's where you get the word slave from. It comes from Slavic. The single largest market for slaves at the time was Istanbul. Captured Ukrainians arrived there via the Crimean port of Kaffa on the Black Sea. For Roxolana and her fellow Ruthenians, the journey there was a grueling forced march of nearly 900 miles across rugged country with little food or rest. Further misery awaited them when they arrived in Kaffa. Observing the processing of slaves in nearby Karasubazar, Alevia Chelebi, a 17th century Ottoman courtier and traveler, couldn't help but express pity for the poor captives. There, a mother is severed from her son and daughter, a son from his father and brother, and they are sold among lamentations, cries of help, weeping, and sorrow. So, not a lot of fun, okay, admittedly, to be a slave. But as terrible as all that sounds, it's a mistake to compare the slave trade in the Islamic world to the southern slave trade in the United States. Southern slave owners usually kept their slaves in ignorance by denying them access to education. They didn't want them to learn how to read and write, because if you could read and write, you could write notes to each other, you could send messages, you could, drum up news of a rebellion, you could organize, you could read abolitionist literature and whatnot. So it was important to the slave owners in the South to keep the slaves uneducated. Opportunities for freedom were, pretty slim to none. Manumission, or being freed, was rare, and so was the chance to buy your own freedom. That didn't happen very often. The best chance you had was flight, which was always risky, and also, unless you made it up north, there was practically no chance whatsoever that you could aspire to be anything but a slave in Southern society. Well, in contrast, in the Muslim world, female slaves who entered the harem were provided with an education in Islam. They were trained as musicians, singers, dancers to entertain at court. They were taught how to read and write. Not only that, but they were educated. They were taught, how to compose poetry. They studied literature, history, religion, while some additionally went on to pursue philosophy, arithmetic, and science. So the harem, you really have to think of it more like a women's college, believe it or not. It was a place where women they lived together, they supported one another, they were educated, they ran businesses. They weren't just lying around in bikinis waiting for the Sultan to come along. Yes, they were also taught the art of lovemaking, yes, because some of them were concubines. Many of the residents were concubines, but it was a fairly good life. And being a slave is never great, admittedly. However, I just want to point out that it was a much different environment than you may imagine, and that's important to understand. So, but it wasn't all collegial. Not everybody got along. There was a lot of competition. Roxolana, through a combination of her wits and charm, managed to outmaneuver and displace her main rival in the harem, a woman named Mahidevran, who was the Kadin, or the first concubine, which culminated in a fairly scrappy encounter, which I will read to you from my book here. In a violent confrontation that took place sometime in the 1520s, reported a few decades later by Ambassador Bernardo Navigero, there are those ambassadors again. These are the guys who were talking about all this stuff. The enraged Kadin confronted her rival, shouting, "Traitor, sold meat," meaning something bought in the bazaar. "You want to compete with me?" as she furiously clawed at Roxolana's hair and face with her nails. Summoned by Suleiman a few days later, the chastened and abused Ukrainian maid cleverly sent word to him that she was not presentable enough. Baffled, his desire to see her quickly turned into a demand. Upon entering his chambers, she tearfully related to him what had happened, showing the Sultan her face, which still bore the scratches. The enraged Sultan then sent for Mahidevran, who not only admitted what she did, but brassily added that she had done less to Roxolana than she deserved. Her haughty lack of remorse inflamed the Sultan even more, at which point he no longer wanted her, and all his love was given to the other. So, Roxelana was no fool. She knew just what she was doing. As a matter of fact, she not only, I mean, when she got into the when she was attacked by the Khaden, by her rival, she knew that if she hit back, it was against the law for her to strike her because she was her superior. So she just took it, and she knew that what she was doing was going to get her where she wanted to be. She wanted to be the first wife, and she knew that this was going to get her rival banished. And so I'll present myself with all these scratches and bruises and whatnot to the Sultan. And the Sultan was crazy about her. He loved her. He thought she was great. She had a great sense of humor. She could sing. She made him laugh. He had listened to her counsel a lot. And so, but think of the harem also as it's like a corporation. It really is. I mean, what do? Right? When in a corporation, you want the guy's job ahead of you. You let him screw up, right? And then all of a sudden you're standing there. Oh yes, boss, I can do that, right? So that's kind of what she did. She was no fool, and so she ended up getting her way. She ended up being the Sultan's Khaden, or the first concubine, which, again, think of corporate life, right? There are a lot of people behind her back going, "Oh, what a bitch! Oh man, I can't. No, this woman, we got to stop her, right? I mean, she's out of control. She's running the show now." And so there were jealous rivals, and not only within the harem, but outside. The courtiers, the nobles, were like, "What are we going to do? She's telling the Sultan what to do." And they thought, all right, well, of course, the only excuse could be she's a witch, right? That's it. So, and there was according to local, I don't want to say custom, but rumor, that you could, if you got hyena bones, you could ground them up and turn them into a potion, and that would disarm a witch. It would disempower her, and so they were trying to get hyena bones. They were trying to buy hyenas in Istanbul, but somebody, the guy who had hyenas, said, "I'm sorry, they're all for Roxelana. She's got them all reserved." So anyway, you can tell that these women were clever. They were skilled at political maneuvering. Now, something else that they had in common, and this was a real major point in the book, is many of them came from cultures where women were taught from an early age how to ride, how to shoot, how to hunt, how to fight alongside and against men, in addition to running businesses and governing as well. And the territory we're talking about here are the Eurasian steppes. This is a broad swath of grasslands extending from Eastern Europe to China. And among these people, women were regarded as equals, worthy of respect, and even fearsome warriors. In the 10th century Didi Korkut, which is an epic folk history of the Turco-Mongol tribes of the Central Asian steppes, an Oghuz tribal warrior is asked by his father what kind of virtues he looks for in a potential wife, and in this case, a princess by the name of Lady Chichak. So his response was, when the father of Lady Chichak's suitor asks his son to describe to him the best sort of wife for an Oghuz warrior, the son replies, "Father, find me a girl who will rise before I get to my feet, who will be on horseback before I mount my well-trained horse, who before I reach my enemy will bring me some of their heads. That's the sort of girl to find for me, Father." So that's quite a Tinder profile, I would say. I mean, okay, she's an early riser. That's good. Swipe left. Nice. Athletic. All right, that's good. I don't know about the heads. The heads, it seems like a woman you don't want to disappoint. But anyway, some historians believe that such women were the inspiration for the legendary Amazons. These are classical era sources, such as Herodotus referred to women of this part of the world as going on horseback into battle and hunting alongside the men of their tribes. So there's been this long, strong feminist tradition among the people of the Central Asian steppes. And why? Well, if you're a tribal, nomadic, or semi-nomadic people, you can't afford to have half the population just sitting around. Right? There's just too much to do. There's too much work to do. You have to move a lot. and you really can't afford to have. I mean, everybody's got to pick up their end of the couch, and so that is why women were expected to take part in every part of what needed to go on in the society. Um, so when the descendants of these tribal people became Muslim, they didn't abandon these cultural customs and beliefs. So some of these women, like Roxalana, for instance, descended from tribal people from the Central Asian steppes. The first one, Shajarat al-Dur, she was a descendant from what are called the Kipchak Turks, which are close to Turkey, up in the Caucasus region. Um, but this tradition of women being part of society, equal parts of society, uh, existed, and then many of these captured slaves ended up being in the empire, not just the women but the men, and they became what were known as Mamluks, and the Mamluks eventually rose in the ranks of society and ended up being sultans. So it wasn't unusual, it wasn't unthought of or unheard of for women in these cultures to be in charge. That's my point. And so a lot of them came from these cultures. They descended from these cultures. So what changed? How did all that change? Well, it had a lot to do with the insatiable appetites of these guys during the period of history depicted here and the centuries leading up to it. My book covers roughly 1,000-year period from the 8th century, about 100 years after the founding of Islam, to the end of the 17th century. And during that time, Islamic empires pretty much ran the show when it came to commerce, anyway. If Europeans wanted access to the riches of the Far East, like spices and textiles and porcelain and luxury goods, all kinds of luxury goods, they all came from India, the Far East, and to get them, you had to go through the Islamic world. The Islamic world, the Muslim traders were the middlemen, and you couldn't get the stuff without going through them. But once Europeans figured out how to navigate their way around Africa's Cape of Good Hope down there, right, to get over to this other part of the world, to the east, they cut out the middlemen, and everything changed. And as the Islamic empires began to decline, European colonial powers stepped into that vacuum, and they began to colonize what had predominantly been the Muslim world. But unlike the Muslims, who were far more tolerant, believe it or not, they were far more tolerant of other peoples and cultures and religions. So the European colonial powers were just the opposite. They mistrusted locals and superimposed their own cultural systems on the people that they conquered. So in European culture, especially during the Victorian era, women had only two functions in society: taking care of the household and bearing children. And that's pretty much it. So when Europeans conquered Muslim civilizations where women were educated or took part in the political process, or were armed, right, and had a seat at the table, they didn't know what to do. They were shocked. So as Western colonialism spread across the wider Muslim world, the imposition of appropriate gender roles remained central to the imperial stability. Politically savvy, politically powerful women who insisted on a seat at the table threatened the patrimonial colonial domination upon which the whole system was erected. So even though some women rulers continued to sit on thrones or serve as local rulers in Muslim-majority countries, they did so under the yoke of European colonial control. And just as an aside here, ironically, the two people who were arguably responsible for the transformation of Europe into a global colonialist power were two queens, Elizabeth I and Spain's Isabella of Castile and Leon. The Dutch and the Portuguese had established trade with the Muslim world, but it was Elizabeth and Isabella who really expanded and transformed the medieval kingdoms they inherited into early modern empires. Elizabeth did it through the commissioning of a navy, which became the world's most powerful, right? I mean, England was famous for its navy, right? Because it's an island, and they can't do much, right? You can't have an army march across, the English Channel, but you can send ships, right? And so the navy became everything for England. And then Isabella, who financed Columbus's journey to the New World, which set in motion a whole cascade of events leading to Spain's dominion over half the world. So ironically, you have two women to thank for that colonial expansion. In modern times, there have been many female heads of state in Muslim majority countries with a significant Muslim population. You may recall Benazir Bhutto, who was the first Muslim woman to lead a Muslim nation, in modern times. Meanwhile, we have yet to elect a woman president of the United States. And there are a handful of Muslim women in Congress, you can see below. Still, access to power remains an uphill climb for women, as studies have shown. In 2018, the Harvard Business Review published an article showing that men and women are often described differently in performance evaluations, even though they had the same jobs and met the same goals. Meanwhile, women who advocate for themselves are more often shunned in the workplace than men. So, and I don't know if you can read the caption there on my little cartoon, but it's saying when a woman has someone's head cut off, I'm a bitch, right? Is that it? That's what she's saying to her king husband there. But the women in this book let none of that stand in the way of their duty or their responsibilities. And I just want to finish by reading you the summation here, a little summary that I wrote. So the paths that today's Muslim women have traveled to public office were blazed by the women profiled in this book. Their courage and determination, their dignity and achievements serve as examples and inspirations for women everywhere, no matter what their faith, while their stories emphatically answer the question, were there really any Muslim women rulers? Well, yes, there were. There were indeed. So that's it. That's my talk. Thank you. I'm glad to take any questions if you want. I'll try and answer any questions. Yeah.
A couple of comments from a fellow author a few years older than you. Number one, when I was advising some of the largest family businesses in the world, there was a tendency of the powerful man, often a narcissist, to allow his daughters to have authority, but not to allow his sons to do so. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There was several classic examples. Then we go to the next stage of narcissism, and many of our leaders are narcissists, as we can see right now today. And we notice that this ability of women who are often attractive and often very power-oriented and clever to control men is still very much with us. And when we look at the women in the present government run by a narcissist, isn't it an unusual coincidence of how attractive most of them are? And isn't it interesting that we have perhaps the largest number of women who are cabinet members? And when you look at each one of them, there's a similarity, and that is the ability to manipulate and manage men that you mentioned. So I was just going to say that this is not restricted to the Muslim world. It's very much in our world. Look at Gates and Bezos and others and what happens to them when they're the most powerful men in the world. A lady 20 or 30 years younger comes along interested in power and manages to get it. So this theme of how women get power is an old one, but it's also terribly new.
Okay. Well, I'd like to respond to that if you don't mind.
No, please do.
Part of that, first of all, in terms of the beauty of the women in the administration, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, I would say. It all depends on, so there's that. And then, but in terms of the number of women in the cabinet, I don't know. I'd have to look at the facts there to see how many women have been in previous administration cabinets. But I will say that the difference between the women in the current cabinet or administration are not nearly as qualified as the women who I've talked about, today here. I mean, let me tell you that the women that I've talked about today would not have gotten hired because they're too smart. They're they're too capable. And so, look, I will say that many of the women that I'm talking about were supposed to be, not all, but many of them were supposed to be beautiful. I mean, their looks got them somewhere, got them noticed anyway, right? And but not always though, because let's say you were in the harem and you were a bimbo, okay? Let's say you're a bimbo in the harem and you're there and you're not going to get very far if you can't hold a conversation, if you can't, talk intelligently about the affairs of the day, if you don't have some knowledge of Islam, if you don't have some knowledge of the law, if you're not able to discuss science and what's the, so it wasn't just, look, I mean, look, we're all guilty. I mean, how many of us have looked across the room and said, "Oh, that looks pretty good," right? Then you go over and start talking, like, "Oh, maybe not," and
I
so
wasn't talking so much about the fact that they were terribly attractive. I was talking about their ability to manipulate, manage, and get
okay.
control themselves,
Well,
which is the same quality that you were
right.
talking about in many of these women.
That's true. Some of them were able to. Well, let me tell you. All right, let me give you an example with Nur Jahan. Nur Jahan, India's empress, right? She ended up ruling because her husband was a drug addict and an alcoholic, and he was totally incapable. I mean, he loved her very much, and he needed her. So she didn't quite. I did mention that some of them manipulated. That's true, but let's say she was accused of running the show and manipulating the government, but in truth, she loved her husband a lot. And if anybody here in this room has had somebody who's been an addict, or know someone in the family, or know somebody as a friend who has some people who have an addiction problem, you know how hard that is. And yet at the same time, you want to support them. And so she took over because she kind of had to take over. And so she's one good example. Roxelana, who I mentioned about, yeah, she was snatched off she came from a small village in the Ukraine, and was this daughter of a poor priest. And she looked around and she said, you know what? I mean, I've got to make, I mean, I can make it here, I can make it anywhere, right? I mean, that's what she said. She was in one of the biggest capitals of the world, Istanbul at the time, and one of the richest places on earth. And so she said, yeah, I'm going to go for this. And one of them I didn't talk about, a Nigerian queen named Amina. She didn't have to manipulate anybody. She wasn't going to take anything from anybody. She was a warrior. She learned when she was a young girl, she would it was supposedly, according to legend, she would crawl into the throne room where her father was the king, and he was, negotiating treaties and planning battles and whatnot. And she would crawl in and right past the guards on her knees, and then he would pick her up and put her on his lap. And she just had an ability. She just had an inclination towards leadership. And when she became a young teen, a lot of her contemporaries were learning how to, and they were learning how to sew, and they were learning how to do all these sort of domestic things. And she said, nah, I don't want to do that. She was learning how to use a sword, how to use a lance on a horse. And so when her father died, um, she took over, and nobody questioned it. Matter of fact, she also, according to legend, uh, every time she led many battles all over West Africa. She expanded the kingdom, and every night she was supposed to have taken a different lover, and not only that, but she cut his head off in the morning, so he couldn't talk, right? So he couldn't go around and brag about, hey, I just slept with the queen, And so she was an incredibly powerful, scary person. And so, yeah, but your point about, but we all manipulate, to some degree or another. So I wouldn't say it's just women. Yeah.
I have two things to say. One, I don't quite know really what you're talking about. I'm going to assume it's from an okay place. A lot of women in this room. But we don't really know what the women look like because they were painted by someone who may have accentuated their beauty in order to make them happy or make other people happy. Secondly, what you said just doesn't sit right with me. I can't articulate right now what's so bothersome about it. But you did say that that power is a form of manipulation for everybody. Emperors do clothes type of mentality.
Mhm.
Like if you're in charge, people are going
Yeah.
to tell you what you want to hear.
Right. Right.
So this whole sort of dichotomy that was brought up between
Mhm.
Judaism and Judaism versus any type of power. Interesting, because I can't really articulate why. But my question is about the word Muslim and Islam. Very interesting that they sort of work in together as
Mhm.
one thing, but they one could be considered sort of the religion, and one is sort of like, and then the other is kind of like country oriented. Sort of go through a little bit of that. Kind of,
Sure.
yeah,
Sure.
make it clear.
Well, Islam is the faith,
Yeah.
and then something Islamic, it reflects that faith's culture. Could be the architecture, could be the food, it could be the music, clothing, whatever. So Muslim is a person, like a Christian is a
Yeah.
person, but it's also used adjectively, the Muslim world. Some academics don't like that. Some would prefer Islamic world, but so they're kind of interchangeable in a way. Uh, so I,
So is the lineage like Ishmael and Isaac, with Jacob and Esau?
the Muslims are the Muslim faith is
Ishmael,
descent, Ishmael, the children of Ishmael
and then
from
the
Abraham.
lineage was
Abraham fathered Ishmael, and then Isaac, right? And so, but I just want to mention on the physical beauty. You mentioned that, they probably enhanced it in the writing. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Roxelana was written about as being, she was okay looking, sort of. That's what some of them wrote. They was like, some thought, I don't know what the big deal is, right? And others, though, praised her beauty. Sometimes images were done from life later on, or from very good, descriptions of what they looked like. Earlier ones, yes, absolutely. You don't know what they look like. You have descriptions from historians, but not all the historians had an axe to grind, or were trying to suck up to the queen. But I will say, though, what an important thing to remember is that these women, the very fact that they were written about, right, and their histories were preserved, says to me that they were special, right? They wouldn't have been written about. They would have just been dismissed. And so that we have these records, and a lot of these records, they come from a variety of sources. And if you take a look at the back of the book, you're going to see them all. Thanks to Molly, if she's still here. Um, uh, and they were from just a whole variety of places. And some of them were written by some of the colonialists who visited, like the Dutch and the English. When they began to explore this part of the world, they would visit the court, and they would writing up about Nur Jahan in India, and they would say, you're not going to get anywhere unless you go through her. I mean, that's it. And they realized this. And so, but the physical beauty, it might have been with many of them, but not all of them. Yeah, I'm sorry. Right.
Everything running the world way back then. What happened?
You mean what happened here in America, or what happened in the world? I'm sorry? Oh.
It's just the idea that how did we use
Mhm. So
we're from Europeans who settled here. Today I feel like we're going certainly backwards, but that supremacists, that white men, like madmen, women are back in kitchens.
so the question is, if women, if I'm correct, if women has historically in Europe had places of power, been in places of power, positions of power, what happened over here in America why are we so patriarchal? And it's a great question, and I think that it has to do a lot with the people who came over and settled here, and also, the society here was driven a lot by, and there's a great book about this, by the way, which I encourage everybody to read. It's not one of mine. It's called oh God, American Nations. And I might even suggest another book reading, another book club on this book. This guy, Collinwood is his last name, I believe. And he writes about how the America was founded by a whole different peoples, different cultures settled in different parts of America. And they brought with them what they had learned, right? And so Appalachia is different from New England, which is different from the Southwest, which is different from the Deep South. But why women have not been traditionally and historically more empowered here in America, I think has probably just a lot to do with the men not wanting them to do that, and they've had to fight. I mean, we didn't have the Equal Rights Amendment. It still hasn't been passed. I mean, it's been proposed. It was proposed like in the 70s, I think, right? And it still hasn't been passed. Women haven't been able to vote in America. So what was it? Was it that 19? Like it was 18? I can't remember. It was like, I can't remember when they passed that. But women couldn't even have a checking account, for God's sakes, in America until the 70s, right? Which is absurd. It's just madness. So I think you had a power structure of men who just didn't want to let go. But for a lot of different reasons. Maybe because they were misogynist, maybe because they were afraid that if they were more, broad-minded, that they would not be respected by their colleagues, and then they would not be able to succeed. And some people are just Neanderthals. Well, Neanderthal is giving Neanderthals a bad name, actually. But anyway, yes, go ahead.
I admittedly have not read the book yet, and I'm getting a copy tonight, so thank you.
Sure, thank you.
But when we refer to this region of the world, we refer to it as the Middle East, and when we talk about middle of what? It's the United States, and so there's that inherent kind of American exceptionalism that comes with that. So I'm curious, standing here as a white man, how were you able to ensure that you didn't have kind of that inherent biases coming as a white man from the United States when you were writing these stories in the perspective of these women? Because I would imagine when we're talking about hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, stories can be passed on, but it's oftentimes from the lens of, our world or European world. So how were you able to kind of navigate that?
Well, first of all, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, and so I've become very accustomed to the culture there and the sensitivities that one has to have. I lived there, and I studied a lot about it, so that's how I got an appreciation there. And also, I was very careful to try and get things right, when I was writing the book, which is why, if you get it, you're going to see it. It's a very lengthy bibliography, very long. And I was very careful about my sources, and I called into question ones that I thought were questionable. And so I think that, putting those two things together, yeah, it's weird. Honestly, I mean, I'm going to stand here and say, yeah, it's weird. It's weird to have this guy like me writing about this. It should be one of you, right? I mean, but it just interested me. Here's why. You know what interests me the most about these women was that they're good stories. That's it. At the heart of it all, they're just great stories. And I'm a storyteller. And if you read this book, I think you're going to be enthralled. I mean, like I said, it is like Game of Thrones and The Godfather. And
I think more men like you should be interested in telling these kind of stories.
Well,
And I think that's what makes the world
well,
exciting,
thanks.
so
Thanks.
thank you.
But well, I look. You know what? Let me tell you this. I support feminism in the women's movement, but I'm not one, and so I never will be, right? Well, I mean, I could today, I don't know, but what I mean is, it's like me. It's like me joining the Black Panthers, right? I mean, I can support the Black Panthers, or I can support the Black Lives movement, right? But I'm not a black man, so yeah, right. So, but I just, I was just so it began with that learning about that one woman. I was as dumb as the best of them, right? Until I found that story, and I said, "Whoa, that doesn't make sense. Hang on." And I just began to learn more and more and more. And as I learned more and more, I said, "Wow, these are just terrific stories, and these women are great." And I did honestly fall in love with each one of them as I was writing about them. So yeah.
I don't know where the mentality of women should be barefoot and pregnant is coming from, and I can't even stand that thought of it. But
The Victorians. The
so
Victorians.
Today, I'm talking about today.
Yeah. Well, it still comes from them today.
I know, but why it's coming back?
Anyway.
But my question is, in the pictures that you displayed, some women had their hair covered, some didn't. When did that start? Why did it start? And is it something that just came and went and came and went? I don't know.
That's a good question. Did everybody hear that? Where did the tradition of head covering come from? And first of all, if you look at images of women in ancient Rome, they have their heads covered. Even in Greece. So it's a long tradition. It's not just in Islam. In Islam, there is a verse in the Quran that talks about women coming into, I mean, not women, strangers coming into Muhammad's house, and his women relatives were there. And he told them, make sure you cover yourselves up. There were these strangers coming in. Just in the same way, if the UPS guy came to the door and you were in your nightgown, you might throw something on. I don't know. I mean, just as a matter of, hey, you want to be modest, right? So now, a lot of women in Islam covered their heads, but one of the queens, Razia, she did wear a veil for a long time. She was in India, and then at one point she said, "The heck with this! I'm not going to do this anymore." And she decided not to, and she put on what were like male's clothing. I mean, comfortable clothing, right? And she went out and into the towns and the villages, and she met with the people, and she helped decide legal matters and whatnot. She became a real a friend of the people. Whereas before, and what made her do this, I think, was she just had enough, and she realized that she wanted to be more available to her subjects, and so doing it riding around in state, right, on top of an elephant, just wasn't going to do it. And so she abandoned that tradition. The word in India, it's called in purdah, P-U-R-D-A-H. It means to be covered. Some of these women talked from behind like a screen. There is that kind of modesty, I guess. But the topic of the veil and whatnot in Islam is a big one, and I'm not prepared to talk too much about it here, but I will just say that to many Muslim women, it's a choice. To some of them, not. My personal feeling is, if it's not a choice for you and you're made to wear it, I don't think it's right. But if you choose to wear a veil as a Muslim woman, then because you want to, as a sign of your faith, as a sign of you just don't want men staring at you all the time in your hair, it's their choice to do that. And so if it's their choice, I support that. But it can be, sometimes it can get pretty ridiculous. I mean,
but the Quran doesn't actually say.
It doesn't say wear this veil. It just has this story, and that's where a lot of some of these traditions come from in Islam. There's something in the Quran or the Hadith, which are the collection of sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So, but sometimes there are extremes, I think, with Muslim women wearing the veil are just given such a hard time. I mean, like several years ago, there was some woman on a beach in southern France, was arrested. It was illegal for women to wear this, like it was like a one piece one-piece bathing suit, head to toe kind of thing, or head to ankle, anyway, right? And they were being dragged off the beach. They were being arrested for wearing this. But meanwhile, you know, some 15-year-old daughter of some guys walking down the beach in a thong, right? I mean, come on, get some equanimity here, right? I mean, so it doesn't make sense to me to have men tell women what to wear, basically. You know, you can wear what you want, really, or do or say, right? Or who to vote for. Yeah. So anyway, I'm afraid I might get myself in too much trouble if I go further. But if there's any other questions, did I miss anybody? Did I miss something I want to say?
Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.